Moscow, March 1953. A cramped interrogation room in the basement of Lubyanka prison. The air smells of concrete dust and fear. An American intelligence officer sits handcuffed to a metal chair bolted into the floor. He has been searched 4 times in the past 6 hours. His shoes removed and examined. The heels pried open. The insoles peeled back. His belt confiscated. His watch disassembled. Every seam of his clothing inspected under bright lights. The NKVD officers are meticulous. They have found his suicide pill, a tiny capsule sewn into his collar that he never got the chance to bite. They have found the microfilm hidden in a hollowed coin. They have found everything. Everything except the blade thinner than a razor, narrower than a pencil, tucked into a specially designed pocket behind the metal button of his shirt cuff. This is the story of the Soviet Union's most ingenious concealment weapon. A knife so impossibly small that Western intelligence agencies initially refused to believe it existed. A blade designed not to win fights, but to create a single moment of absolute chaos when everything else had been taken away. By the late 1940s, the KGB and its predecessor organizations faced a unique operational challenge. Soviet intelligence officers operating in hostile territories, in Western Europe, in occupied zones of Germany, in the emerging battlegrounds of the Cold War, carried documents, carried weapons, carried tools for their work. But the moment an officer was captured by British MI6, American CIA, or French intelligence services, all of that equipment vanished. Western security services had learned from captured German Gestapo manuals. They knew every hiding place, false heels in shoes, hollowed belt buckles, secret compartments in briefcases, the gap behind coat buttons, the space inside fountain pens. Captured officers were stripped, their clothing examined under magnification, every item cataloged and tested. The interrogations that followed could last weeks or months. Safe houses in West Berlin run by American intelligence, MI6 facilities in London where defectors were processed, CIA black sites that would not be publicly acknowledged for decades. Soviet officers who fell into Western hands faced relentless questioning. They wanted names of other operatives embedded in Western governments. They wanted details of espionage networks across Europe. They wanted information about Soviet intelligence gathering capabilities, radio frequencies, encryption methods, the location of dead drops and safe houses across dozens of cities. Some officers resisted, some broke. Almost none escaped because an unarmed prisoner locked in a guarded room in enemy territory has no realistic options. The guards are trained. The doors are reinforced. The building is in a hostile city where the prisoner speaks the language imperfectly and knows no one. The KGB needed to provide its officers with something Western intelligence could not find. A weapon that could survive the most thorough search protocols. A weapon accessible even when the officers' hands were restrained. A weapon small enough to hide in a place searchers would never think to examine, but sharp enough to sever a major artery in a single motion. The solution came from a design bureau operating under extraordinary secrecy somewhere in the Moscow industrial district. Records from this period remain classified even today, but examination of captured examples and defector testimony from the 1960s provides a clear picture. The weapon measured between 25 and 35 millimeters in total length. The blade itself was a sliver of hardened steel, single-edged, honed to an edge measured in microns. Some examples featured a slight curve, others were straight. All were designed for a single purpose, penetrating skin and reaching the vessels that ran close to the surface at specific points on the human body. The handle, if it can be called that, consisted of a small textured grip area, roughly the size of a shirt button. The entire assembly weighed less than 8 grams, lighter than 2 sheets of paper, small enough to balance on a fingertip. The genius of the weapon lay not in the blade, but in the concealment mechanism. Soviet designers created a system of false pockets, reinforced areas of fabric, and specially designed buttons that could house the tiny blade in locations Western searchers would never examine closely. The most common placement was behind the metal shank of a shirt button. The button itself appeared completely normal from the outside. 4 holes for thread, a standard diameter, made of common horn or plastic depending on the cover identity of the officer, but the metal shank that attached the button to the fabric was hollow. Inside this hollow shank, accessible by unscrewing the button counterclockwise exactly 3 full turns, sat the folded blade. An officer with even limited hand mobility could reach a shirt button. Handcuffs restrain the wrists but allow finger movement. A seated prisoner can reach their own chest. The motion of adjusting a button appears innocent, nervous fidgeting while under interrogation stress. 3 turns counterclockwise. The button separates. The blade drops into the palm. Total time from decision to armed, approximately 4 seconds. Soviet training facilities, particularly the Red Banner Institute outside Moscow, incorporated the tiny blade into escape and evasion curricula starting in the early 1950s. Students, future intelligence officers destined for deployment in hostile territories, learned the weapon's capabilities and severe limitations. Instructors emphasized that this was not a fighting knife. The blade was too small, too fragile. A direct thrust against bone would snap it. An attempt to slash would accomplish nothing. The weapon had exactly one viable use case: creating a medical emergency that would force interrogators to react. Soviet combat medical doctrine, derived from battlefield experience in the Great Patriotic War, identified several surface vessels that could be reached with a very short blade. The external carotid artery ran approximately 15 millimeters beneath the skin on either side of the neck. The radial artery at the wrist sat even closer to the surface, protected only by skin and minimal tissue. The brachial artery inside the upper arm could be accessed with a blade as short as 20 millimeters if the angle was correct. Training emphasized speed and commitment. The officer would get one chance. Interrogators standing close, leaning in to make a point, reaching to adjust restraints. Any moment of proximity. The blade had to move fast, had to find the target on the first attempt, had to go deep enough to matter. Soviet instructors taught that severing a major superficial artery would cause immediate blood loss visible within seconds. Western interrogators would react predictably. They would shout for medical assistance. They would attempt to apply pressure to stop bleeding. They would unlock restraints to provide medical care. They would create chaos and confusion. In that chaos, a Soviet officer had perhaps 15 to 30 seconds of opportunity, enough time to grab a weapon if one was accessible, enough time to reach a door if it was close, enough time to create a violent incident that might, if everything broke in the officer's favor, result in escape. The weapon appeared in the field starting around 1951 based on Western intelligence assessments. MI6 first documented an example in 1954 when a Soviet illegal, an officer operating under deep cover without diplomatic protection, was arrested in Vienna. During processing, a British security officer noticed that one button on the man's shirt seemed slightly loose. Closer examination revealed the concealment mechanism. The discovery triggered immediate alerts across Western intelligence services. New search protocols were implemented. All buttons on captured personnel were to be tested, twisted, examined under magnification. Seams were to be opened. Fabric was to be X-rayed. But the Soviets adapted. Later versions of the blade were concealed in belt-buckle tongues, inside the metal tips of shoelaces, within the frames of eyeglasses. Each new hiding place required Western services to expand their search procedures. Each expansion took time to implement across all facilities. The psychological impact on Western interrogators was subtle but real. The knowledge that a prisoner, even one thoroughly searched and restrained, might still possess a weapon changed the dynamic. Interrogators maintained greater distance. Physical intimidation became riskier. The mere possibility of a hidden blade, even if never used, altered the balance of power in that windowless room. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now, here is what we know about how these weapons compared to what Western intelligence agencies were developing during the same period. American CIA Technical Services Division produced several ultra-compact blades during the 1950s. The most notable was a lapel dagger approximately 50 millimeters long, designed to be sewn into the collar of a jacket. This weapon, while concealable, was nearly twice the length of the Soviet button blade and required a fabric pocket for concealment, making it more detectable during thorough searches. British MI6 issued thumbnail blades to operatives in certain high-risk deployments. These measured roughly 40 millimeters and attached to a small ring worn on the thumb. Effective in close quarters, but visible to anyone conducting a proper hand inspection. The Soviet button blade, by contrast, was invisible until deployed. Western agencies also developed pencil daggers, devices disguised as writing instruments with concealed spikes. These worked well until searchers began testing every pen and pencil by attempting to write with them. A pencil that cannot make a mark becomes immediately suspicious. The KGB blade required no disguise beyond the ordinary button it hid behind. In terms of lethality, all of these weapons shared the same fundamental limitation. A blade under 50 millimeters cannot reach deep vessels or vital organs. These were not assassination tools. They were desperation measures, final options when every other avenue had closed. The documented historical record contains frustratingly few verified accounts of Soviet officers actually deploying these blades during captivity. This absence tells you something important about the weapon's true nature. First, the vast majority of captured Soviet intelligence officers never faced a realistic escape opportunity, regardless of what weapons they possessed. A blade cannot unlock reinforced doors. It cannot defeat multiple armed guards. It cannot navigate an unfamiliar city while being hunted. Second, using the blade meant embracing almost certain death. Attacking an interrogator in a secure facility would trigger immediate violent response. Other guards would arrive within seconds. The officer would be subdued or killed. The blade represented a choice between certain continued captivity, with possible eventual release through prisoner exchange, or near certain death in a violent escape attempt, with maybe a 2 or 3% chance of success. Most officers, even those equipped with the weapon, chose to endure interrogation. What we do have is circumstantial evidence and defector testimony. Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB major who defected to the United States in 1961, confirmed during CIA debriefings that button blades were standard issue for officers deploying to Western countries without diplomatic cover. Oleg Penkovsky, a GRU colonel who spied for British and American intelligence before his arrest and execution in 1963, reported that he had been issued such a weapon during his training, though he never carried it during his espionage activities, as it would have been discovered if Soviet counterintelligence had searched him. One unconfirmed account from British intelligence files, declassified in part during the 1990s, describes an incident in a West German interrogation facility in 1959. A Soviet officer being processed after his cover was blown reportedly produced a small blade during initial search procedures and caused significant lacerations to a security officer's forearm before being subdued. The report notes that the weapon was recovered and measured 28 millimeters in total length, concealed in a modified trouser button. No names are provided in the declassified portion, and independent verification has proven impossible. The Cold War's intelligence services operated in shadows within shadows. Successful escapes were rarely publicized. Failed attempts were buried in classified files. The absence of dramatic confirmed accounts does not prove the weapon was never used. It proves that intelligence work, unlike popular fiction, rarely produces tidy documented narratives. What the button blade represented was something larger than its tactical utility. It embodied the Soviet intelligence philosophy that every officer in the field deserved every possible advantage, no matter how small. That an officer alone in enemy territory was never truly without options. That even in the worst circumstances, in handcuffs in a locked room, the trained operative still possessed agency. Modern FSB, the successor organization to the KGB, does not discuss historical concealment weapons in public statements. Current training methodologies remain classified. Whether contemporary Russian intelligence officers receive similar tools adapted for modern security screening, including metal detectors and millimeter wave scanners, is unknown. What we can say is that the Cold War-era button blade solved a problem that seemed unsolvable. How do you arm someone who will be thoroughly searched by professionals trained to find hidden objects? The answer was to make the weapon so small, so perfectly concealed, that searchers would need to literally disassemble every item of clothing to find it. To hide it not in a secret compartment, but behind an object so ordinary that examining every single one would be impractical. In intelligence museums in Moscow, carefully controlled exhibitions occasionally display Cold War-era equipment. Visitors might see encryption devices, concealment coins, invisible ink formulas. The button blades, if they appear at all, are noted briefly without technical details. The specifics remain protected. In Western museums, captured examples sit in climate-controlled cases next to other artifacts of the secret war. The Imperial War Museum in London holds several examples. The International Spy Museum in Washington displays a button blade alongside American and British equivalents. Collectors occasionally offer pieces through specialized auction houses, though authentication remains difficult and prices reflect rarity. The weapon that was designed to be invisible has mostly remained so. But in the interrogation rooms of the Cold War, in the minds of intelligence officers on both sides, the possibility represented by that tiny sliver of steel was very real. It changed calculations. It added an element of risk to what interrogators assumed was complete control. It gave captured officers something no prison cell could take away. One final option, one hidden chance. The possibility, however remote, of turning a moment of proximity into a moment of chaos, of transforming from prisoner to threat in the time it takes to unscrew a button 3 times. That was Soviet intelligence doctrine. That was the KGB.